Musicians and celebrities can influence the public in ways that the government and government officials just can't. What would happen if the government felt like they needed to use those celebrities to change the minds of the public? We're going to take a look at claims that the CIA used a major rock band to record propaganda and influence the public today on Rock Feed. If you're like me, you've been spending a lot of time recently playing the new Call of Duty title, Black Ops Cold War. Now, I'm not very good, but it is a thought-provoking game, and I've spent a lot of time recently thinking about the Cold War era. How close were the US and the Soviet Union to come into blows, or ending up in a nuclear conflict? We may not even be sitting here today if it ended up that way. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and you got to think about what lengths the officials would have gone to prevent such a conflict from happening. And what role did a very famous rock band play in this dispute? By the way, if you're new here, please help us out and drop a thumbs up on this video and subscribe with notifications on. Join the community and help us get to 1 million subscribers. All right, so let's talk about Scorpions. Back in the 1980s, the Scorpions had one of the biggest hits of the decade, Rock You Like a Hurricane. They were everywhere and they amassed a giant fan base, especially over in Europe. And there were rumors that the CIA actually used them to influence their audience. Well, those are the claims being made in the new hit podcast out on Spotify titled Winds of Change. And if you followed Scorpions for some time, you know that that is a Scorpions song. That's the song that they claim in this podcast may have been written by the CIA for the band Scorpions to get on the radio and influence the general public to make the fall of the Soviet Union a little bit more palatable. Rolling Stone has more on this story, and they interviewed the producers of the podcast to ask them about whether they think it's possible that this could have actually happened. The article says, could the CIA have planted hair metal propaganda during the Cold War? This is amazing. It says, what if it turned out your favorite song had been written by the CIA? That's exactly what a new podcast aims to determine. In 1990, just after the fall of the Berlin Wall, West German band The Scorpions released their ballad Winds of Change, which had lyrics about togetherness and the children of tomorrow that sounds like the anthem of the end of the Cold War. But according to the New York Times, Patrick Radden Keefe, there's reason to believe the hit could have been a CIA concoction created to aid the West's fight against communism. In the 8-part podcast, Winds of Change, produced by Spotify, listeners go on this journey and they talk about how Spotify fans, ex-CIA historians, trying to piece together the true story of how this song came to fruition. It's partially a spy paper, it's partially a Cold War era music lesson. It discusses the US government history of exerting cultural influence overseas, especially through music, like in the 1950s and early 1960s with President Eisenhower sending jazz performers Dizzy Gillespie and Louis Armstrong to introduce the American art form to listeners in the Middle East and Africa. So Rolling Stone interviews the founder of this podcast about whether or not he thinks this could have happened. It says, so when you decided on a podcast, how did you start reporting on a CIA rumor, and how is the reporting for audio different than for print? He says, I've written about the world of intelligence before, so I was familiar with the hazards of writing about secret worlds. What was really tricky was reporting for audio. In the past, I've had sources who would talk to me, we meet up and I take notes, and I'm not recording, and they trust in that situation. It's another altogether when you're asking someone to speak into a microphone. There was this kind of crazy OPSEC that we had to employ to talk to Rose, a clandestine officer, where we changed her name and used an actress, but we tried to have fun with it, and it hopefully gives insight to what it's like to do that type of reporting. What do you think would be the greatest challenge going into this? He says, I think it was mainly the secrecy. How do you tell a story about the covert world that doesn't feel like you're just glancing around the edges? And that was the challenge. But I'm really happy with the way we put it together in the end, because a bunch of stuff in there has not really been known until now. Not just the Scorpion story, but I mean the Nina Simone story, this guy Hugh Wilford, this academic who had gone into the files and discovered Nina Simone basically was sent to Nigeria unbeknown to her by the CIA in 61. That one hit me especially strongly because I grew up listening to her. Of all the artists we talk about in the show, she's probably the one who meant the most to me for the longest. How did you get so many ex-CIA people to talk? Slowly, we actually interviewed more ex-CIA people that are in the final podcast. There were some who just couldn't work in the end. It was a slow process. In some instances, I had introductions from people, which helped. I think the intelligence community is like any other subculture. It really helps to have somebody who can be a referee or a broker who can vouch for you. It was tricky in particular because we didn't want to tell people right up front we're making a podcast about whether the CIA wrote Winds of Change. If you announce your initial overture, nobody's going to say yes. What's your understanding of why some former CIA officers can speak so much on the record? Jonna Mendez, who you interviewed, gives TED Talks, but others can't speak at all. That's a very interesting question. It has to do with where you were and what you're doing, how much time has passed, and to what extent you went through the whole process. Jonna has to get everything she says or writes approved through a board to make sure there's nothing classified in there. There may be other people whom it's just not worth the effort. So it's a combination of factors, but it's kind of interesting for us for exactly the reason you said. There are some people who would be really forthcoming, though you'll notice that it's mostly people talking about something that happened longer ago. In Joanna's case, she can tell us all sorts of stuff, but literally when we wanted her to say what country she lived in or that, she was like, you'll have to bleep that out. I can't tell you where I lived 25 years ago because it's still classified. Did you feel like you were chasing a conspiracy theory or a piece of history? Part of this fun of this whole experience is sometimes I felt like I was chasing a really fascinating part of music history. Sometimes it felt like I was chasing a crazy decades-long government conspiracy, and sometimes I felt like a wild tinfoil hat-wearing conspiracy theorist. Goes on to say, how much did you know before you started reporting about the CIA influence operations? I knew a little bit because during these years when this was a back burner thing for me, I had done some research. Francis Saunders wrote the book Cultural Cold War, which is amazing. It's about the earlier years and it's very much about high culture. So there was this aspect of this whole thing that you look into the 50s and 60s, the CIA was basically these very elite white guys who all went to Yale, and they focus on this abstract expressionism, the Paris Review, and jazz. So they have this sense that high culture should be the vehicle for this type of influence effort. Part of this was fascinating just knowing that, but looking at the way, by 1990, it was very much more about pop culture. By 1990, the CIA was not going to be pinning their hopes on Jackson Pollock paintings to win the Cold War. They were looking, obviously, I'm saying this, they were looking for major artists. So how would your impressions of the CIA be affected if they had in fact written this song? He says, I've thought about this constantly as I was working on the podcast, but then just over the years, on the one hand, I think there are a bunch of people, including the CIA, people on the podcast who say how impressive that would be. What an amazing psyop. But there's a kind of undeniable level of mastery you'd have to credit them with for taking this song and sending it out there, and suddenly half of Russia is listening to Winds of Change. At the time, it's unsettling to me to contemplate. There are sort of two parts of the cocktail with this podcast. There's this gee whiz craziness to it, but also I know there are ways when you start unpacking these stories that the implications can also be troubling. Now, one of the things that I think about when I watch this is whether or not in this podcast, and I'm not going to give any spoilers, do the Scorpions eventually admit whether or not they were involved in this, or do they vehemently deny it? On one hand, you would have to think that it would be pretty cool to say, hey, yes, we did do this with the CIA, and it led to maybe a more positive result. On the other hand, these guys are still around, and if you were involved, you certainly maybe wouldn't want to admit something like that because could it possibly put you in danger? I don't know. So there's a lot of different layers to this that are fascinating to think about. But I'm going to tell you right now, if some major studio doesn't come out and make a movie about this or a documentary, man, they are missing out. I want to see this on Netflix. So they go on and say, do you think it's for this rumor you heard, or do you think you'll keep pursuing it? That I haven't figured out. I feel as though I sort of did something I could as a journalist, and yet there are still a lot of questions in my mind. You're asking me on a good day. We just launched the podcast. I feel as though this piece of work that is complete, but check back with me in a few months and we'll see how I feel. So it's very, very interesting to see this sort of unfold. And this was when the podcast first came out, but since then there's been a lot more to the story. The Scorpions were asked about this publicly, not on the podcast, so I feel like I'm not spoiling anything. So Eddie Trunk actually had an interview with the Scorpions frontman, and to his credit, he brought this question up, the question that's on everyone's mind about this CIA story, and Metal Castle has transcribed it. But he is speaking to them and says, earlier this year, I did an interview. I think his name was Patrick Keefe. He came all the way from New York City over here to Germany and did an interview with me, and my bandmate did a phoner later. And this was about the Moscow Music Peace Festival, about Winds of Change. But this is what this interview was all about. He used to write printouts for the New Yorker and stuff. He was a great guy, very sympathetic and a really nice guy. And this is what's interesting. The singer of Scorpion says this guy comes out and he says he's going to do an interview about one thing, and then in the middle of the interview, he brings up the CIA stuff, just right in the middle of the interview. So it seems like he was asked for the interview under the guise of something else, but then this guy kind of springs it on him, and he had no idea he was working on this podcast. So he says, and in the middle of the interview, he goes like, have you ever heard the story that Winds of Change was written by the CIA? And I cracked up laughing. I totally cracked up laughing. It continues to his words. He reacted to his claims by saying that if he thinks he makes an interview with the songwriter, or he thinks that this makes an interview with a spy. It was pretty bizarre. And then I learned the story. This was all about the podcast that would come out in May, which is now. These guys, they were very professional and very creative, and the way they put it together, it feels like a Netflix series, right? That's what it is. It's a podcast, and there will be a lot of people who will get into this. It's a fascinating idea, and it's an entertaining idea, but it's not true at all. He says the interviewer was also very serious about the issue. He added the words that the interviewer spent serious time to interview the songwriter of Winds of Change. After that, he concluded his words by saying that the rumors are fake news. I thought it was very amusing, and it just cracked up laughing. It's a very entertaining and really crazy story, but like I said, it's not true at all. Like you American guys would say, it's fake news. Wind of Change is taken from the band's 11th studio album, which was released November 6th, 1990. So on one hand, this could be a completely fabricated story. On the other hand, of course, if you were involved in an operation with the CIA not even that long ago, you're not going to publicly admit it. You're not going to say, okay, you guys figured it out. Of course I didn't do it. This is just not something that's going to happen. You're not going to come out and just admit it. And as the creator of the podcast mentioned, if you want to say these things, you have to go through boards and stuff like that. You can't just admit it. So basically, if this was true, he would never admit it anyway. I would almost be more skeptical if he just came right out and said, yeah, it did happen, because it would make him look really cool or something like that, or maybe not so cool, depending on where in the world you are. So I want to know what you guys think about this. This is a really interesting story to me. Have you listened to the podcast, and what was your perception of it? I don't know about you, but I would love to see a movie or a documentary series on Netflix made about this as well. Maybe adapt that into a video format. But anyways, folks, that is all for now. Again, thanks so much for joining us at Rockfeed. Drop a thumbs up, leave a comment, and subscribe so you don't miss out on breaking news and updates. Thanks again for joining me, and we'll see you all very soon. Maybe, just maybe, you might enjoy one of these clips. Join me on Instagram and Spotify for news you may not find here. And if you really want to do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. It's the best way to support.